welcome to the History Society podcast. Today is our debut episode and we'll be talking to the Vice President, Rhys Smith. He'll be bringing us a story that he wants to talk about and I have no idea beforehand. Hey Rhys, how are you?
I'm well, Brodie. Yourself?
Yeah, I'm pretty good. So, what story do you have for us today?
Well, today I just want to talk about the rescue of John F. Kennedy by Australian Indigenous coastwatchers in the Second World War.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a not very well talked about topic. Like often the story is really all about Kennedy being a hero, but a lot of people don't know that he was rescued by Melanesian coastwatchers who volunteered, and it's just a really interesting example of the often ignored Indigenous contribution to the Allied war effort.
Sounds awesome. Let's get right into it.
Sure.
So, how does the story start?
Well, the story starts, it's a dark and very foggy still night in the Second World War. We're talking, it's nearby what's known as the Tokyo Express. So this was a channel of ocean where very fast Japanese destroyers at night would ferry arms, supplies, munitions, everything, and extra soldiers down into New Guinea to continue fighting. And the reason they went at night was to evade the superior Allied air power. JFK was there as a commander of a PT boat. So PT boats they're tiny. They're about 30 feet long. They're unarmored, and their job is basically to motor around really quickly and quietly and launch torpedoes at bigger ships. So that was their job. They were there trying to sink the destroyers of the Tokyo Express and disrupt the Japanese resupply of quite famous battles like Guadalcanal. In the early hours of the 2nd of August, PT-109, which was JFK's command, was patrolling this slot, but it became separated from the other boats in the unit. They decided to maintain radio silence, and so they waited in this perfectly still, pitch-black night. Apparently there wasn't any moonlight, so you could barely see anything. Soon they heard the engines of a destroyer, and quickly realised it was coming in right at them. JFK gave the order to try and evade it, but it was far too late. The Imperial Japanese Navy destroyer, it was the Amagiri. These things travelled at about 60 kilometres an hour, rammed the torpedo boat near the front and cut it right in half. As a result, 2 of Kennedy's crew, they were killed immediately, and the rest were thrown into the water amidst burning fuel and diesel and all the other debris. So over the next couple of hours, they clutched to the remains of the wreckage still floating, and Kennedy would swim around, assembling all of his men and trying to bring them together. An interesting fact, so Kennedy was on the Harvard swim team. He was a very competent swimmer, and one of the men was really, really burned. So Kennedy, in a famous story that was later played up during the campaign, literally towed this man several kilometres by holding the strap of his life jacket in his teeth. As the rest of the boat was sinking, they made the decision to swim to the nearest island. This was a pretty serious swim. This is the middle of the night in unknown tropical waters full of coral and God knows what else. And they swam about 3 or 4 kilometres to get to the nearest island, it's a huge effort. Eventually, they would get there into this empty island, and all they could have to eat was coconuts. And over the next couple of days, Kennedy would swim about another 10, 15 kilometres total out in the different channels, visiting nearby islands, looking for help and looking for people.
Is it a shame that the New York president was a better swimmer than Harold Holt, our Prime Minister?
Yes, it's a huge shame. Australia, the only country to lose a head of state. Not have one killed, we just lost him. But, just happens out here. Don't know. Yeah. So
sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so eventually the Americans were stumbled across by 2 Melanesian coastwatchers who are Biuku Gasa and Aroni Kumana. So these coastwatchers, they provided the men with food, water and cigarettes to this, at the moment, quite sick and hungry crew. You have to understand, some of them were severely burned, but also they'd been cut on coral and their cuts were getting really infected. They didn't have enough food, they didn't have enough water. So these men had been sent out by the Australian coastwatcher Arthur Evans, who, during the night of the attack, had seen the boat actually explode after it was rammed. So he'd sent these scouts out, and over the next couple of days, they finally found Lieutenant Kennedy and his crew. At the suggestion of the scouts, this is one of my favourite parts, Kennedy scratched a message with his bayonet into a coconut, which was then paddled back over several days to Evans, who radioed US Naval Command. This coconut, it still exists, by the way, and when he became president, the coconut sat on his desk in the Oval Office. So several more days would pass before the Navy was able to effect a rescue, and the whole time the crew would have to keep dodging Japanese air patrols. This is a Japanese-controlled area, by and large, and so the coast watchers and the U.S. servicemen had to be very careful and make sure they weren't found.
Do you know how deep into enemy territory this was?
We're talking a fair bit. So it's contested territory in a lot of ways, but this is considerably behind enemy lines. So
Okay.
this is not a great place to be helpless. But eventually it was the night of the 8th August, so we're talking 6 days after the initial sinking. They were picked up in the middle of the night by a second PT boat who had managed, the logistics had been managed by the coast watcher Evans to pick up, and the signal for pickup was to fire 4 shots was the signal, but Kennedy realised he only had 3 rounds left in his pistol, and so borrowed a captured Japanese rifle off one of the coast watchers to make the 4th shot. So we're talking, this is a midnight pickup, so this is, again, in hostile waters. It's quite dangerous, all the lights are off. It's very difficult to pull off, but they still did it. And the crew were picked up and taken about 40 kilometres home, so that's how deep they were into Japanese territory. Yeah, and this incident made world headlines, of course. It's the son of the former US ambassador to the United Kingdom, very wealthy, famous family in the US, and his father made damn sure that this story was circulated widely and published widely. Sadly, but not unexpectedly, the focus was almost entirely on Kennedy. Even the heroics of the American crew member was omitted, but in particular, there was virtually no mention of the Indigenous coast watchers and the Australian coast watcher who more or less effected the entire rescue.
That's a shame, for sure. Were they honoured at home?
No, sadly. So Evans was, because he was Australian and we weren't too bad at recognising our intelligence operatives. But unfortunately, Garza and Kumana were not recognised in any official capacity by either their government or anyone else's. And in fact, when JFK was elected, he would invite Garza and Kumana to his inauguration. So JFK remembered what they did. And so they made their way down to Honiara Airport to try and get through. But Solomon Islands officials refused to let them leave the country because they were considered, with their, poor pidgin English and bad clothing, to be an embarrassment to the country. I think this story in particular, this exemplifies how Indigenous servicemen have been largely omitted from the histories of the war.
And also acts as sort of a precursor to JFK's involvement in the civil rights movement in America, and also how far we still had to go in Australia.
Yeah, perhaps. It shows that, and indeed the wider coast-watching service is quite fascinating and really underexplored. And it did rely heavily on Indigenous volunteers. So the way it would normally work, you would have 1 or 2 white Australian intelligence officers, and they would be behind enemy lines with a big old radio. But they had to move frequently so the Japanese wouldn't find them. And that required, the radios back then, they weighed 40 or 50 kilos, and then there's the generators to run them, and then there's the petrol to run the generators. And so often it was not unheard of to have, up to 20 volunteers with each coast watcher to help them move all of their equipment back and forth. There's one Australian coast watcher was literally stationed on the top of a volcano in Rabaul with 10,000 Japanese troops underneath him, less than a kilometre away, all the time sending messages about their movements out. It was incredibly dangerous work, and it would not have been successful if it hadn't been for the Indigenous servicemen.
And just another piece of the huge puzzle that helped us win the Second World War.
Absolutely. Well, Admiral Halsey, one of the US Supreme Commanders, would actually praise the Australian coast-watching effort as critical to winning the Battle of Guadalcanal, which, if you know anything about the war, was when that was the furthest the Japanese got through Papua New Guinea and that part of the world, and that's when the tide started rolling back. And it was, quite a tense pitched battle, and part of the reason we won was that because we had coast watchers giving us advanced warning of, planes coming in or reinforcements coming in, and just giving that little bit of extra insight to helping win that campaign. And they would actually, through the rest of the war, as we advanced in the island hopping campaign, prove very decisive.
So one last question. Did Kennedy return back to the front, or did he seen enough action for the time being?
Kennedy would return to the Navy. As I understand it, he went on to... So he was, after only about a month, he recovered and returned to duty, was given another PT boat, which was refitted into more of a gunboat. And then yeah, he would take part in the deployment and rescue of Marine units, especially Marine Special Forces units. And then he'd be wounded again for his back injury, which would, as we know, plague him throughout his presidency. He was famously on many, many, many drugs to get through the pain for that, especially during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he ended up actually retiring before the war ended from the Navy Reserve on physical disability. Yeah, he went on to continue serving in the war, which I think is to his credit. Being a rich man, he could quite easily have gone home and done the propaganda tour. But yeah, and but it's interesting because this story also, it's the beginning of that famous issue with chronic pain that would plague him for the rest of his life.
Well, that's a fascinating story. Thanks for bringing it to us, Rhys.
Sure, not a problem. It was a bit short, but I think it's insightful, and it says a lot about a lot of different parts of the war, I think. Allied cooperation, but also especially the Indigenous contribution.
Yeah, it's a short piece of story that we like to do here. It's a fascinating topic that not a lot of people would have heard of before.
Yeah, I think obviously in the way we tell these histories, not a lot of people know that the only reason JFK became president and all of the results of that was because two Melanesian coastwatchers paddled out for several days looking for him.
Thanks for that, Rhys. To everyone listening, I hope you enjoyed our first episode. Be sure to follow us on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. The music at the start was As Soon As by The Bearded Cat.